Hi, Danny. I truly miss you. Love you.
So I'm Mike Roberts. I worked at Park for about 10 years and left in August of last year. And over those 10 years, I got a good chance to work with Danny a lot, intermittently over the first 9 years. And then last year, when I joined Carl Dent's group working on natural language and AI technology, I worked a lot with Danny. And so I'm very sad at this event. So this is exactly the kind of event that you'd expect to find Danny wandering around somewhere, and then you'd have a conversation with Danny. And of course, he's not here, at least in his physical form anyway. So I think Danny, I'm going to keep this kind of short, because I think Danny taught me one really fundamental thing. And that was, the most important thing is actually the question. So it's, what question are you actually trying to answer here? And then there's kind of a corollary, which is, would you know what the answer was if you saw it? So by sort of focusing around on the fundamentals of the question, and whether the question is an interesting question that you could develop an answer to, it really kind of turns the whole equation around in a very non-confrontational way, because it's sort of about what sort of fundamental force of nature, essentially, you're trying to kind of grapple with and understand here. So that was one of the fundamental things, amongst many others, that I learned from Danny, and I'm going to miss his presence greatly.
I'm Pat Hayes. I worked here at Park for a short while, but mostly I knew Danny through the fact that he and I were both presidents of AAAI, and me being right after him, our 10 years, as it were, overlapped. I was the assistant editor of the AI Journal when he was the chief editor, so we collaborated on the business of the journal a lot. I have many stories about Danny, but there's only time for one, and this is a very personal one, but I think it's worth getting recorded. The way the AAAI presidency works is that one is a president-elect for 2 years, then president for 2 years, and then past president for 2 years. The whole thing lasts 6 years. So the presidencies, as it were, overlap. Which meant that by the time I was at the end of my presidency, the 2-year presidency, Danny and I had been working on this thing together for 4 years. Now, at that time, I had a personal problem, a health problem, which was that I was an epileptic. The epilepsy was well controlled, but I was subject to the occasional seizures, and the way the seizures worked is they would stop me from speaking. The problem was a problem in a brain injury in childhood in my temporal lobe. I was having to give the presidential address to a very large audience, and one of the very few times in my life when I have been absolutely terrified with stage fright. I was going up the steps to the stage to give this talk, feeling like I was mounting a scaffold, petrified that I might have a seizure. And Danny had been, and I had been speaking earlier, and at the top of those steps I stopped to pluck up my courage and looked back, and at the bottom of the steps Danny was standing looking at me, and we made eye contact, and I felt like in his soul, he picked me up and carried me onto the stage and told me it was okay to speak. It felt that way. He was a very, very supportive man. And I owe him a lot for that moment, and for many other things. But that one is one that is hard to describe, but impossible to forget. And I really miss him. Even though we haven't worked together for many years now, I miss him. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Bob Bauer, and I worked here for 36 years and worked with Danny in various capacities over probably 25 of those years. My earliest recollection is I was a physicist here right out of Stanford, and wanted to know what all that other stuff was in the other part of the building that was making the world famous, and got an opportunity to be on a study group. And there were two guys who made the biggest impression. One was John Seely Brown, and the other was Danny Bobrow. And Danny was on this group to figure out, and now the park was 10 years old. It was actually in the 11th year of park, around 82, 81, that what should park be doing in the next dozen years. And Danny was just not only remarkable to work with, but took me under his wing because I didn't know much about systems at the time other than some of my education. And the first thing he did was to tell me to use this newfangled way to communicate that was called email, which none of us had at the time. And one thing led to another, and one day I would become his lab manager and seek his advice and education on what to do. I have 2 or 3 very distinct memories. Danny and I had offices next to each other a couple of times while at Park. And I still tell this story to this day where one day he comes in and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, Bob, I know you were on a long distance call, but that doesn't mean you have to raise your voice. And it was, to this day, I tell people that when they say, Bob, you're talking too loud, I tell them that story. And the one that's the most important that he taught me, which is something that should be in his legacy, I don't know if he invented it, but it's absolutely true, and that is that men and women age psychologically at different rates. And Danny explained to me once when I couldn't believe how he was always older than I was, but he was always so young at heart. And I said, Danny, how can that be? And he said, well, Bob, don't you know women's psychological age and their mental age and their physical age, they're correlated really well. But men, after they hit 18, they start aging at half the rate that they would, which makes absolute sense to me. So what we have to think about is that when Danny Bobrow left our world, he was, let's see, if he would have been 81, I think, 82, 81, he would have been 81 minus 18 is 63 divided by 2 is 31 plus 18. He was finally almost 50 years old, but he was still in his 40s. And you know, people in their 40s, they're at the height of their powers and their sense of being in charge of the world. So Danny and Bobrow family, it was my great honor and pleasure to run into Danny many times a year at City Arts and Lectures when he and Tony would seemingly always be 2 rows away from where we were sitting, and getting to be with him over the years from when I was a greenhorn physicist to when I got a chance to work with him as a manager and to learn these very important life lessons. Thank you all.
Hi, I'm Laima Kathleen Graham, and I am the sister-in-law of Danny Bobrow. I'm married to his little brother, Rick. And Danny was at our wedding 30 some odd years ago, and such a wonderful, wonderful, supportive brother-in-law, so kind and generous and understanding. And I just really loved him, and I'm really going to miss him. He was such a wonderful spirit to have around. He was interested in everything I did. So that was great for me because I'm the Shiksa sister-in-law and kind of the outcast, but he loved everything I did. He came backstage when his little brother Eric and I were doing our first dance concert together, and he just was always present for us in so many ways, came to not only our wedding, but was there with us backstage in our dance concert. He was there for our son's bar mitzvah and my 50th birthday. He was there for Rick's 60th birthday. He loved celebrations. He loved people from all walks of life. He could talk to anyone about anything, any subject. But the one thing I want to leave people with is he was really kind of a yogi. I'm a yogini, and he would always say, just keep breathing through your right nostril and looking through your left eye.
Hi, I'm Eric Bobrow, or known as Ricky in the family, and I'm the youngest brother for Danny. And he was there from the beginning for me, being the youngest. Always was interested as I went in different career paths. He never made a judgment I went off to become a professional performing artist, a dancer for 15 years, but then I came back to computers, and he would ask me about what I was working on. My area was working with architects and doing 3D design software, so he'd say, show me this, and he'd ask me really good questions. He always asked great questions and always was interested in what I was working on and how it was going for me, So I treasure that Danny always wanted the best and didn't judge, was just looking for what would make me or anyone have satisfaction and joy in our lives. So Danny, we miss you, and you'll always be in our hearts. Thank you.
I'm David Bobrow, Danny Bobrow's nephew. It's hard to simply articulate where I imagine I'll carry Danny with me over my life. Obviously, the silver lining moment in the service probably encapsulated a lot of it. And the fact that someone else had said, when you're with Danny, ideas just happen. And I recall moments like that, really wonderful moments where we were just talking and suddenly it became like, wait a minute, why aren't you patenting this thing? Or, Danny, this is really a good business idea or whatever. But he just was rolling with thought and very generous. The other thing I remember that just sort of sticks with me is that when I was around 12, I learned Logo, and the fact that there were members of my family that had their hand in things like that, and the precursors to it, and some of the other stories that I've heard from my relatives over the past couple of days of what he's had his hand in. So it's a very impressive life he led and inspiring, and I think we're all better for knowing him, and those that were really close, his closest family and friends, they got the best.
Hi, I'm Bo Begol. I was area manager for Ubiquitous Computing at Park from 2004 to 2012, and I really just wanted to briefly say how grateful I am to Danny for taking me seriously. And whenever I had ideas, he would actively engage, and he would give comments and suggestions that were always directly pertinent, not just random commentary. So for that, I'm deeply grateful. Thanks, Danny. We'll miss you.
Hello, I'm Kimberly Jennery. I am Danny's oldest daughter. And I just wanted to sort of represent the fact that my dad was a feminist before it was popular to be a male feminist. I'm not sure it's popular to be a male feminist, but he's been one my whole life. And before that, I grew up with erector sets and Tinker toys and blocks, and my dad taught me how to solder. And when I got older, I was part of learning small talk here at Park with the first turtle graphics with an actual turtle drawing program on the ground. And I even worked with my dad and wrote a paper with him and got to experience all of the ways in which he encouraged women, young and old, and just feel really lucky that that's what I grew up with in this world. So I just wanted to share that.
Hi, I'm Aidan Jennery, and I am Danny's son-in-law, married to Kimberly, Danny's eldest daughter. So I've only known Danny probably for about 15 or so, 16 years. And he always struck me as a very, very intelligent, but a very kind and sweet man. He was always very interested in what you thought and what you knew and your opinions, and he would freely exchange with you on subjects of many, many, many different types. So I took just 1 minute to write down, and I think this is probably only over the last year, the different conversations that I'd had with Danny just over the last year or so. We talked about the composition of the universe, light matter, dark matter, that kind of stuff. Poker, databases, indexes, XML, natural language processing, big surprise. Student, Indian food, Khan, both the Genghis Mongolian Empire Emperor Genghis Khan, and also the guy from Star Trek episode and movie. Nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, game theory, Europe, the history of, that's a big subject in and of itself. Specifically something about the Ottoman Empire, World War I, World War II, actually also World War III, natural human languages, unnatural human languages, computer languages, Sherry, and paradoxes. And that's all I could think of in 1 minute about what I talked with Danny over the past year. So as you can see, Danny knew a lot of things outside of his scope of speciality in AI and NLP and related subjects. He could talk for hours and hours on almost any subject, very well read, very well educated, but he has an uncanny knack of taking in information, no matter where he's getting it from, and outputting it in a very human, consumable form, if I could be considered a human. So I am always going to miss talking to Danny. As I said, he's one of the sweetest, kindest man I've ever met. And Danny, I'm going to miss you.
So I'm Danny Bobrow. I'm the wife of Daniel Bobrow, of Danny. And we were married 39 years. And they were perfect bliss. And Danny was the most remarkable husband. I want the world to know that. He was so loving, understanding. He said the best things. His love was infinite. And I'm glad that every day I told him how wonderful he was. And he was really my prince. So I'm grateful for that.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth, and I have known Danny through Tony for many years. And his big heart I have known, and I was really touched and feel so grateful for a gift he gave me when I visited him in the fall. And Tony woke him up a little bit and said, Danny, Elizabeth's here. You remember Elizabeth? And he looked and he said, unforgettable. It was the sweetest thing. And he was the sweetest man.